I still remember the exact moment I slipped the ring onto her finger, hands trembling, eyes locked, the world narrowing to just the two of us beneath that oak tree. In that moment, I wasn't just making a promise. I was anchoring myself to something real, something permanent. "I'll never hurt you," I whispered, and I meant it. Back then, forever felt simple. Solid. Her name is Layla, sharp-minded, graceful, the kind of woman who makes silence feel like a conversation. We met in college, both of us stubborn in our own way, but somehow our edges fit. Over time, our lives stitched together seamlessly. Shared breakfasts, lazy Sunday mornings, her laughter echoing in the kitchen while I fumbled with pancake batter. Ordinary moments. But they felt like home. Now, 6 years married, we live in a modest townhouse on the quiet side of the city. It's not lavish, but we built it together, our fingerprints on every inch. I work in finance, long hours, spreadsheets that blur into each other. Layla's a teacher, always brimming with stories about her students, her eyes lighting up as she shares the smallest victories. Lately, though, things feel different. Not wrong, just dulled. Conversations once filled with excitement now trail off into silence. We still say "I love you," but the words land softly, like a routine rather than a revelation. We're not fighting, not even close. But the spark that once burned bright feels more like embers now. Life got busy, and we stopped noticing. Last Thursday, after dinner, she sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through lesson plans while I sifted through emails. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "Remember when we used to just talk?" I nodded, forcing a smile. I wanted to say something, to promise her we'd fix this, to tell her I missed her too. But the words tangled in my throat, and instead, I buried myself deeper in my screen, and that's where the distance grew, not in anger or betrayal, but in the quiet. The unspoken. It was the next day at work when I first noticed her, Ava, the new project coordinator. Confident, quick-witted, the kind of person who enters a room and somehow commands attention without trying. We were paired on a campaign, her ideas fresh, her energy contagious. We spent hours discussing strategy, sharing jokes between meetings, our synergy instant. But that's all it was, just work. At least, that's what I told myself. Still, as I left the office that night, Layla's words echoed in my mind. "Remember when we used to just talk?" And for the first time, I wondered, what if someone else was listening now? I drove home in silence, the weight of something unspoken pressing against my chest. I had made a promise, one I swore I'd never break. But promises are easy when temptation isn't knocking. Ava wasn't just another coworker. She was magnetic in a way that made the air shift when she entered a room, unapologetically confident, her laughter crisp and unfiltered. She didn't tiptoe around conversations or hide behind polite small talk. Instead, she dove straight in, bold, unafraid, and effortlessly engaging. We'd only worked together for a week, but it felt like longer. Our brainstorming sessions blurred into easy banter. She challenged my ideas without hesitation, raised an eyebrow at my overused buzzwords, and laughed, really laughed at my dry humor, the kind Layla used to appreciate before exhaustion dulled her edges. One afternoon, we stayed late to finalize a presentation. The office was nearly empty, the city lights flickering through the glass walls. We sat close, hunched over the same laptop screen, our shoulders occasionally brushing. It was nothing. Or it should have been. "Tell me something no one at work knows about you," Ava said suddenly, her voice low, curious. I hesitated, fingers pausing over the keyboard. "I make terrible pancakes. Like, inedible. My wife pretends to love them." She smiled, eyes holding mine for a moment too long. "Lucky woman." I laughed, brushing off the flicker of discomfort. But that look lingered, a spark, subtle but undeniable. Driving home that night, I kept thinking about that moment. It wasn't the words. It was the ease. The way she listened genuinely, without judgment or distraction. At home, conversations had become rushed, sandwiched between responsibilities. But with Ava, I felt seen. Heard. That realization unsettled me. The next morning, Layla kissed me goodbye at the door, her hand lingering on my arm. "Don't forget about dinner with my sister tonight," she reminded me. I nodded, distracted, already thinking about the long list of tasks waiting at the office and about Ava. Throughout the day, I caught myself seeking her out, her laugh across the room, her perfume, the way she leaned in when she spoke. We weren't flirting. Not really. But something was there, threading itself quietly between us. I told myself it was harmless. I was married. I loved Layla. This was just a connection. Nothing more, but as the days passed, that line between connection and temptation began to blur. Lunch breaks extended. Texts became more frequent, laced with inside jokes and lingering pauses. Ava never crossed a boundary, but the way she looked at me, curious, unguarded, felt like an invitation. When I wasn't sure I had the strength to ignore point one evening, after a particularly long meeting, she touched my arm, light as air, and said, "You're easy to talk to. Don't let that go unnoticed." That night, I lay beside Layla, her breathing soft and steady in the dark. I stared at the ceiling, Ava's words echoing in my head. It started with a knock at the door that I wasn't expecting anyone. Not out here, not with James gone. I wiped my hands on a towel, heart thudding, and peered through the window. A man stood on the porch, dust on his boots, a ball cap in hand. He looked familiar, and when he smiled it clicked. Mark Dawson. That we hadn't seen each other in years. Not since high school when we'd shared art class and awkward smiles across lunch tables. He'd moved away after graduation, chasing rodeos and ranch work, while I stayed behind, planting roots that grew tangled over time. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said as I opened the door. "I was passing through and saw the for hire sign by the fence. Thought maybe you could use a hand." The sign. I had forgotten it was even there. James's idea to hire help for the fencing repairs he never had time to manage. I hesitated, caught off guard by the coincidence or fate. "I remember you," I said, stepping outside. "Mark Dawson. You used to draw horses better than anyone in school." His laugh was low and easy. "Still do when I find the time." We talked for a while. About the pasture that needed mending, the barn roof that needed patching, the way this town hadn't changed much, except maybe we had. Something about his presence felt effortless, grounding, like slipping into a familiar song. I hired him that day. Over the next week, Mark became a fixture, fixing the fence by day, sharing coffee on the porch at dusk. He never pried, never asked about James, but he listened when I spoke. Really listened. His eyes didn't drift to his phone, and his laughter wasn't forced. It had been so long since someone looked at me like that. With curiosity, with recognition. One afternoon, I found him in the barn feeding Storm an apple. The horse nudged him affectionately, and Mark laughed, turning toward me. "He likes you," I said. Mark's gaze met mine, steady and unguarded. "I think I do too." The air shifted. My breath caught that I looked away, heart racing. "Mark," he didn't press. Just nodded, setting the apple core aside. "I get it. You're married." The unspoken but hung heavy between us. And for a moment I didn't feel married, not to the silence, not to the absence. I felt alive again. That night, alone in bed, James's side untouched, I couldn't shake the warmth of Mark's eyes or the sound of his voice. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the growing connection or how natural it felt. James returned on a Sunday, unexpected, unannounced. I heard his truck before I saw him, the familiar rumble stirring a mixture of dread and resignation in my chest. I met him on the porch, arms folded, heart guarded. His eyes scanned the yard, landing briefly on the repaired fence, the freshly painted barn, and finally on me, as if assessing what had changed in his absence. "You hired help?" he asked, setting his suitcase down with a thud. "I had to. Things needed fixing." My voice was calm, but I didn't look away. James nodded, lips tightening into something almost like disapproval. "You should have waited." "For what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You." Silenced as he walked past me, into the house that once felt like ours. I followed, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Inside, he glanced around, noting the subtle shifts. Flowers on the table, light filtering through clean windows, the smell of home-cooked food. A home that had continued, thrived even without him. Later that evening, he found me in the barn brushing Storm. His presence was a shadow, unfamiliar and heavy. "I know I've been gone a lot," he said, leaning against the stall. "Work's been demanding." I didn't respond. "I'm doing it for us," he added, softer now. "To build something, security, a future." I set the brush down, turning to face him. "We already have something. But you're never here to see it." He flinched, as if realizing too late the cost of his ambition. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The question hung in the air, but I knew the answer. I wanted presence, partnership, not just in words but in moments, in effort, in love. I wanted to feel seen. But something had shifted. I had shifted. "I want to find myself again," I said finally. "And I don't know if I can do that with you always gone." James stared at me, the weight of consequence settling in his eyes. He didn't argue, didn't promise to change. He just nodded, resigned, perhaps understanding. Weeks passed. Mark didn't return after James came home. Not out of avoidance, but respect. He left me with space to choose, and in that space I found clarity that I didn't cross a line, but I had stood on its edge and seen what I was missing. Connection, understanding, life. And I wasn't willing to live without that anymore.